Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm El-Khoury, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Amy Karger, who's an associate professor at the University of Minnesota and also a co-author on the paper that was published in New England Journal of Medicine on the race-free eGFR equation. Amy, welcome, and thank you for joining us today on a discussion on race and eGFR.
Thanks so much, Joe. I'm really happy to be here.
So to begin, for anyone who's not familiar with this topic, what is eGFR?
Great question. So eGFR stands for estimated glomerular filtration rate, and it's basically a way to assess how well the kidney is working. You can measure GFR, but it's a very time-intensive and expensive procedure. So the vast majority of patients are going to have this estimate that's measured or determined instead of direct measurement. The way you get the estimate is you measure a blood biomarker. Usually that's creatinine. There's also others like Cystatin C that are an option. And that's plugged into an equation that incorporates other factors, demographic parameters like age, sex, and race used to be one of the ones incorporated, but is no longer included in the equation.
And obviously, that's one of the big reasons why we're talking today, because that's what changed with the 2021 equation. We moved from the race included to the race-free equation. So why did that happen, and why is that such a hot topic right now?
Yeah, so race-based medicine is a practice that's been going on for a long time because we have, in the past, kind of equated race with biology and felt like it was an objective parameter, but really come to realize race is subjective. It's a social construct. It's not an objective, clear category. And so it's been realized that because it's so subjective, we really shouldn't be changing medical decisions based on someone's race. And there's a lot of examples of where we continue to do that throughout medicine, where medical care is altered due to race. Because there's been a lot of pushback on that, because it does lead to inequitable or different care for patients who are Black in this case, there was a big push to remove that race correction from the eGFR formula. And so the CKD-EPI research group did some work to derive a new equation that doesn't incorporate race at all.
And so how will this new equation that's been developed and published in 2021 impact patient results compared to the previous equations that were in use?
Right. So that's a great question. So we do anticipate some changes in how patients are categorized. So with the old equation, we actually saw that we were underdiagnosing Black patients with kidney disease, and they were less likely to get referred to nephrologists for dialysis, for kidney transplant. So actually, this new equation, by removing the race correction factor, actually brings their eGFRs down, and that means that it will diagnose more Black patients with kidney disease than in the past. So that's actually viewed as a beneficial change because it was felt they were being underdiagnosed previously. It will have a slight opposite impact for non-Black patients. There should be fewer of them, slightly fewer of them diagnosed. But this equation has only been in place for a couple of years. So it's going to take some time, I think, to see the true impact of what the change, of this equation change, and to see how it impacts both clinical care in a variety of aspects, and also research study findings that have been published with the old and the new equations.
So this sounds like it's a positive development in terms of being able to remove race from our practice of medicine. Do you see that the whole world will adopt this new equation?
Yeah, so that's, again, a good question. The challenge with the new equation is its validation, its adoption was very U.S.-centric. It was the American Society of Nephrology and the American National Kidney Foundation that really put forth a recommendation to use the equation, and they didn't really involve international partners in that decision. And so there's been a lot of discussion internationally about what to do now with this new equation. And the responses have been mixed. We've heard from our European colleagues that they are not recommending use of the equation at this time. They have some concerns about its accuracy. There's other responses in other countries when we query experts in Africa and Asia. Some of them are still using the older equations. So I think it's going to take some time to see how well this new 2021 race-free equation performs in communities outside the United States before it is more widely adopted. But it would be nice eventually, in an ideal world, for the entire globe to be using the same equation.
And moving away from race slightly, because you mentioned there are other variables that the equation uses. So race was one of them that we've basically hopefully fixed with this equation reformulation. So you mentioned sex as being another one. So if somebody's categorized as male or female, obviously that will affect how the result is displayed and how their kidney function is estimated using the equation. So how do you see that impacting like transgender patients? Are we going to see another movement where, how do we report this for transgender patients and what would it mean?
Yeah, so that is, I think, the next big topic with eGFR reporting, and frankly, with other lab results that are have different, results based on gender or sex. So I think this is a hot topic of discussion, but there's not a lot of standardization in terms of what different labs are doing. A lot of clinical laboratories are taking their own individualized approaches to how to most accurately report eGFR in a patient where either they've are on gender affirming therapies or they've had surgeries and changed gender, or if they're non-binary. How do we handle that? I will say in our own health system, if there's any uh, boxes checked in their medical record indicating that they are non-binary or gender is unclear, we will report both the male and the female eGFR so that the provider can decide which is the best estimate to use for that particular patient. And I anticipate that's going to be our approach moving forward, is leaving it in the hands of the provider who knows the patient best.
Yeah, and I guess it's important for any listener who's not familiar with this to emphasize that in this case, sex is being used as a surrogate for muscle mass, because what they've seen in those studies, it sounds like differences between men and women that were related to muscle mass. So that becomes difficult in the transgender population and like trying to account for it. So it's helpful to hear that perspective. And then moving away from that variable and shifting back to, I know you mentioned, the paper that came out also had combined equations like that that included Cystatin C, which is another marker that you measure for this. So how do you see Cystatin C being adopted in clinical labs? And would you anticipate that will people be using the combined equation more frequently?
Yeah, so I do think Cystatin C is going to become utilized more. I don't think it's going to nearly approach the use of creatinine. So what I didn't mention before, Cystatin C, one of the advantages of it is it doesn't vary by race group. So they haven't seen those differences between Black and non-Black patients with Cystatin C. So the Cystatin C equation has never had a race correction factor. So it's appealing from that perspective in that there's not any sort of observed differences by race. The challenge with Cystatin C, though, is it's not a routine test like creatinine. Creatinine is available in every lab, clinical lab, big or small. Cystatin C is really a specialty test, and most clinical labs send it out to a reference lab. So it's not something that's available quickly or in a timely manner. It'll take a couple days. And so right now it's just not on a lot of people's radar. That said, the KDIGO, which writes guidelines for chronic kidney disease diagnosis and staging, they are coming out with new guidance this year, and they've already published kind of a preliminary version. And in those guidelines, they do highlight the importance of relying on Cystatin C more than in the past. So I do think once those guidelines come out, there will be more labs looking at using Cystatin C. And specifically to your question of using both biomarkers, those guidelines do suggest that while we should still just use creatinine for routine screening, that the combined equation that relies on creatinine and Cystatin C should be used if you're making an important clinical decision, such as diagnosing someone for the first time with chronic kidney disease.
Excellent. So at your institution, are you currently reporting both? And how does that reporting structure work? Are you basically running all three and giving all three results? Or are you simply, for different patients, choosing which one is reported?
Yeah, so right now we've only had Cystatin C in-house for a couple of years. So even we were sending out testing for Cystatin C prior to that. So it's kind of a new thing for us. Right now, we are just allowing the provider to decide if they want to order the Cystatin C. So it's not a high volume test. And then we report the eGFR based on Cystatin C alone. We're not doing any reporting of the combined creatinine and Cystatin C results equation for patients. Some have suggested ultimately that we might want to get to a point where we report all three estimates, the Cystatin C alone, creatinine-based estimate alone, and then the combined creatinine Cystatin C estimate. The reason being is that if all three are similar, then you could use the combined equation, because the combined equation with creatinine and cystatin C has been shown to be the most accurate of the three estimates. But if you see a discrepancy between the cystatin C and the creatinine-based estimates, that's when you recognize that this patient has an issue, some sort of what we call non-GFR determinant that's affecting the accuracy of either cystatin C or creatinine. And that's when the clinician should do a deeper dive and figure out which of the two filtration markers is inaccurate for assessing kidney disease. One good example is if somebody has extremes of muscle mass, because creatinine is affected by muscle mass. So if you have like a quadriplegic or paraplegic patient who has low muscle mass, their creatinine-based estimate's not going to be accurate, and you need to just rely on cystatin C. So that's the benefit of having all three estimates reported. But I don't know of a lot of labs doing that, and there's a lot of concerns about confusion. If a provider is to see three different GFR estimates, they may not know what to do with that or what the next step is in terms of interpreting those results.
Excellent. So finally, what recommendations would you give to laboratories that are looking to make that jump from whatever equation they're using to the new equations?
So there was a really nice paper published in 2022 by the National Kidney Foundation that outlines in a lot of detail how a clinical lab can go about implementing the new 2021 equations, either moving from the 2009 CKD-epi-creatinine equation, or a lot of labs were still using MDRD, which was the predecessor to the CKD-epi equation. So this is a very nice document that kind of lists out different recommendations about how to communicate to providers. That's a key piece. You have to communicate about the equation change. You don't want to just turn it on without allowing communications to go out broadly, both to nephrologists, but also to primary care who rely heavily on eGFR testing. So they understand the differences between the old and the new equation. So that's one key emphasis, is communication. They talk also about how to implement it from a practical perspective, programming in the formula, testing it, making sure it's working properly. You always want to make sure that's checked. And then the other important thing they point out is reporting of it in the medical record. They really emphasize the importance of not reporting the old and new results on the same line in the medical record. So they want it to be clear to the provider that this is a different formula. And so they want it to not be kind of in line, so that they don't want the provider to be able to trend results from the old and new equation. And so that's another important piece. But it's a really nice document. Again, it was published in 2022 in Clinical Chemistry, put out by the National Kidney Foundation. And it even has sample language you can use for those communications. So it can make it really easy for clinical labs to implement the new equation.
Nice. No, that's very helpful to hear, and that you have that help and support, especially as you transition to those new equations. And that did bring up, now that you mentioned that, I remember, with all of these developments with these equations, we've obviously gotten to a point where we're now at the 2021 race-free CKD-epi equation. But yet we know, like in our institutions, pharmacy is still, for example, still using the Cockroft-Gault equation, which was developed in the 70s. Where do we stand on that, and what can labs do?
Yeah, so that's a really challenging issue, because traditionally, as you said, the Cockroft-Gault equation has been used to adjust dosing for medications based on a patient's renal function. And it's a long-standing practice, and it's really hard to change, because a lot of drugs that have been in use for years were FDA approved based on Cockroft-Gault renal dosing. And the FDA isn't requiring drug manufacturers to go back and update those applications. Now, the FDA did update their guidance in 2020 to recommend the newer equations and recommend a move away from Cockroft-Gault. But the problem is that there's, most of the medicines we use today were approved before 2020. So, and therefore the pharmacy community still heavily relies on that very outdated equation. But it's really been shown not to be accurate, and especially because it was developed at a time when creatinine assays weren't standardized. And so that brings in a whole other wrinkle of inaccuracy into that equation. So there is a lot of push. The National Kidney Foundation recommends not using Cockroft-Gault anymore. But I think it's going to take a lot of effort to get that longstanding practice of using that equation out permanently.
Well, Amy, that was very helpful discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And thank you all for joining us today.